Morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. I'm Catherine Doan and will be moderating today. There are unique challenges, workforce challenges, and opportunities in the agri-food sector. Employers are seeking qualified candidates for planting, harvesting, processing, marketing, researching, and selling Ontario's healthy, high-quality food, beverage products to the agri-food products. Going on to the next slide, through the Canadian Agriculture Partnership Funding, OFA, agcareers.com and careersandfood.com, as well as its other partners, we have come together to coordinate a support system for agriculture and food employers from field to fork to feed Ontario's future. Through this collaboration, we have launched the Feed Your Future initiative. This program delivers essential areas of support to employers and job seekers to assist them with navigating the employment market that's been affected by COVID-19. The Feed Your Future team, with support from agcareers.com, careersandfood.com, are delivering through Feed Your Future a concierge service for employers and job seekers, virtual webinars, and career fairs. Today, we're very pleased to have with us to cover rules and regulations, navigating employer regulations and requirements, Jennifer from the Canadian Ag Human Resource Council. Jennifer grew up working on her family farm equipment dealership and helping the farm with the farm in southwestern Ontario. She has worked in the field of human resources research and development for more than 20 years. With expertise in inclusion, diversity, leadership, HR policies, and workforce culture, as well as research, analysis, facilitation, program management, and evaluation. Jennifer has quite the background, as you can see. She's worked with several industries, including agriculture, to bring partners together for projects related to inclusion and diversity, and skills development, training, and education. And we're really pleased to have with us today Jennifer from the Canadian Ag Human Resource Council. Thank you, Jennifer. Joining her is Stefan, who works for the Ontario Fruit Vegetable Growers Association. Stefan really focuses on priorities related to labor and to safety nets. He also works with Ken Forth on the Labor Issues Coordinating Committee, where growers can help seek when they are concerned about an issue and they have with the Provincial Ministry of Labor. He'll be sure to answer lots of questions and will be supporting Jennifer today in that capacity. So thank you both for joining us today to go over the rules and regulations, navigating employer regulations and requirements. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jen. Thank you, Jen and Stefan.
Thank you, Catherine. And before we get started, we are going to be talking a lot about obviously regulations and responsibilities of employers. We do want to remind you that some of the information we're providing is going to be specific to COVID-19, but also beyond that, some of the regulations and responsibilities have been altered a little bit with COVID-19 as well. So neither Stefan or I are complete experts in this area of legislation. So we do remind you that this webinar is for information. It's to share what we know and what we're aware of, but we are not legal consultants, and we would advise you to consult with the sources provided in this webinar, as well as legal advice should you have any other questions regarding this. So getting started. First off, let's just start what we're going to talk about around HR legislation. Why is it important? So all employers must understand and comply with legislation, and having those HR policies and practices on your farm are a way to ensure that you are providing an environment that meets this legislation. You want to ensure that you're aware of the legislation that is applicable to you so that you can avoid doing things like, discrimination, and that you're providing opportunity for all. You also want to make sure that your firm aligns with the federal and provincial standards, and that you're really providing those best practices in your workplace, so that you are not only working within the regulations and responsibilities, but providing a really great place for your employees to work. So we're going to start and just with a bit of a federal overview of the legislation, and then we'll get into provincial and move on to some of the COVID-19 specific information that you should be aware of. So in a legal context, the Government of Canada and all provinces and territorial governments have human rights codes to safeguard equal employment opportunities. And these things do apply to, this legislation does apply to everything from, those recruitment ads that you're putting out there looking for new employees, all the way through the hiring process, termination, promotion, really all aspects of employment. And there's some real key employment standards that you should be aware of as well that is set out in legislation, both federally and provincially. And it's important to determine if your business is federally regulated or provincially, territorially regulated. In a lot of cases, in agriculture, it's going to be mostly provincial that you fall under. There are some occupations that may be federally regulated, like long haul. I think it's truck drivers that are crossing provincial borders, that kind of thing. Again, you're going to want to confirm that on the government websites. And businesses such as grain elevators and that type of production is also federally regulated. But most of the other work that is done in primary production will be provincial. Again, just check that out on the Employment and Social Development Canada website. You'll be able to confirm if you're federally or provincially regulated. Some of the things that you need to be aware of on the Canadian federal side of things are the Canadian Human Rights Act, the Charter of Rights and Freedom, Employment Equity Act, and the Personal Information Protection and Electronics Act. So we'll just go through those from an information point of view. The Human Rights Act is something that I think we're all aware of, and it's designed to ensure that all individuals have those equal opportunities for employment. And there are additional federal and provincial human rights commissions that are in place to help mandate that and foster that equality, and to ensure that any complaints that might come up are able to be addressed. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, again, is focused around equality, commitment to fair workplace practices and opportunities, and making sure that that your workplace acknowledges the equal opportunity that may not have always existed in Canada, but is definitely part of our landscape today. There is also the Employment Equity Act, which outlines how employers must recognize the special measures and accommodations of differences. And it's an act that ensures, again, that those employment barriers are replaced with positive policies and reasonable accommodations. Definitions that you will probably have heard of already or may have heard of are things like duty to accommodate and undue hardship. And this is the act that outlines some of these areas and obligations for employers. Something else that came into place in 2004 as we kind of moved to more of a electronics and electronic records environment across Canada is the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act. So this is something you might not think of usually applying to your employees, but it is an act that is applicable to your workplace, and you do need to be aware of the obligations under this act and making sure that you have the consent required from your individuals before your individual employees before disclosing any personal information, and how to use that personal information in a way that will protect the privacy of your employees as well. There's also health and safety legislation. Again, depending on if you're a federally regulated or provincially regulated workplace, this health and safety legislation may vary a little bit from where you're looking at. The Canadian Centre of Occupational Health and Safety is a really great resource to look for information on what's required through the legislation. It's also a good place that provides provincial information and links as well. So you can really link into whatever information and legislation that you're going to need to ensure that you're following all the health and safety guidelines and requirements as well. From a provincial overview, which is going to be a bit more applicable to most primary production, as I mentioned, we'll go through some of the things that are in place in Ontario. We're going to go through a number of acts. Again, we are not necessarily experts in all of this. This is a way to raise awareness, and there are things that are applicable specific to primary production in some cases. So I will be giving you the overview of the information on the acts you need to be thinking of. And through the Q&A, Stefan will be able to speak to a little bit about some of the nuances about how some of these acts are applied in primary production. And again, there's lots of information available on the government websites. And so we do encourage you to look for supporting information through these sites as well. So many of you will already know the Ontario Ministry of Labour is one of the main regulators for employment in the province. And there is the Employment Standards Act of Ontario that is in place in Ontario. And for those provincially regulated workplaces, it talks about things like minimum wage, hours of work and overtime, public holidays, vacation, all that kind of information. And it does outline what those requirements are. All of these do have a bit, there is a nuance, as I said, that Stefan will talk about as far as primary production and how it applies specifically to that. So as I mentioned, there's the Employment Standards Act. There's also the Labor Relations Act, and this is really specific to unionized workplaces. And so depending on whether or not your workplace is unionized, this is an act that you should be aware of. It talks about things around collective bargaining, rights to organize, and promotion of good labor relations. There's the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Many of you as employers will be aware of this as well, as you are making sure that your employees on the farm or in primary production have the proper training and PPE required. But again, it's very good to be aware of this act and how it applies to your workplace. In addition to that, there's the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act, which covers injuries and employment-related accidents. And then there's also the Ontario Building Code, which may sound a little bit out of place as far as workplace laws, but it does provide all of the regulations and requirements around construction of new buildings, renovation and maintenance of existing buildings, again, to make sure that that workplace you're providing is a safe and appropriate workplace.
So Jen, not to interrupt you, but it seems like a good place to pause. We have just had a question come in that says, do all farm employers need to register with the Worker Safety or WSIB? How does that work? Is everyone required to do that?
I believe the answer is yes. Stefan, I'll send that over to you.
I don't have an answer on that one.
Okay.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Okay. Nope, that's fair. So we'll be sure to look that up, and that could probably be in some of the follow-up information that we send out with this recorded webinar. We'll be able to get back to you. And I think that just highlights that a lot of this is working, trying to improve, trying to always change things. So what we know today, and obviously what we know tomorrow could be different. Just while we're on there, the other question is there a minimum length of time for a meal break? If they are in the middle of harvest, is 30 minutes okay? I thought that was a very specific question.
Mm-hmm.
It depends on the source where your workers are from. If your workers have been hired through the federally regulated SOP or temporary foreign worker program, there are, and let me be more specifically through the SOP program, so the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program, there are minimum breaks that are prescribed through the contract. There are two other groups of workers where it completely depends on your specific contract with the worker, and that would be if they are hired through the AgStream program, or if they're any regular worker like that you've hired domestically, so not through any of the temporary or foreign worker programs. In the latter two groups, it's completely up to your arrangement and your contract that you've set up with your worker on when and how long you issue breaks.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So we'll continue on and continue to look at those Ontario workplace laws that you need to be aware of. There's also the Ontarians with Disabilities Act, which is an important act that outlines how opportunities for people with disabilities come into place, and the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, which again is developed to implement and enforce accessibility standards to ensure that that things are barrier-free for Ontarians with disabilities. And we looked a little bit at the federal side of things as far as human rights. In Ontario, there is the Ontario Human Rights Code. This protects people in Ontario to ensure that there's no discrimination in the areas of jobs, housing, and services. And this is something that you would need to be aware of, again, at all aspects of the hiring, from the job ad all the way through to interviewing, ensuring that your questions you're asking are appropriate and that type of thing in the interviews, from hiring and all stages of employment. The Human Rights Code is something that you should be looking at as well. There's also the Pay Equity Act, which again just ensures that jobs be evaluated and work that is traditionally done by women is being paid equitably to work traditionally done by men. And so that kind of gives you all the insights into the acts that you need to be aware of when you're hiring in Ontario. I know there's a number of them there, and it may seem a little bit, overwhelming or like a lot of things to be thinking about. Rest assured, if you go to any of the websites, the Ministry of Labour website, or the information there is pretty clear. At the end of this as well, I will show you that the Canadian Agriculture Human Resource Council has a tool called the Agra HR Toolkit. In that toolkit, we've tried to do as much of the work for you as we can, as far as outlining the standards that you need to be thinking about, how it applies to your workplace, tools, templates for interview guides, how to do a job description, how to do a job ad in a way that meets these standards. We also have a complete employee handbook that again has been developed with policies that meet the standards as outlined as well. So Catherine, do you have a few more questions before we get into the COVID side of things?
Yes, please. I thought this would be another good period to just pause for a moment. Yeah. Are you an employer if there's just family members working on the farm, and do you need to follow these same guidelines?
Yes, you are an employer. So that means that the guidelines need to be met, and that can be tricky because it's hard to think of your farm with your family as a workplace, but it is a workplace. So you need to be aware of that and be thinking about these type of requirements and making sure you're meeting them.
Sure. So I guess along that duty to accommodate, can the employer include non-economic items in consideration, i.e. risk of harm coming to the employee or to their coworkers? So I'm not quite sure on that question, but maybe you understand it better. So duty to accommodate, can the employer include non-economic items in this consideration?
I'm not 100% sure about the question either. What I would recommend is that you take a look at the links that are provided in the webinar and connect directly with the ministry on that to ensure that you're meeting what you need.
Sure. And then this is a more specific question. For overtime, can the employee carry these hours forward to winter time when maybe there is less work available and therefore can take more time off in the winter? Is that possible when work demand is obviously higher in harvest time?
I'll give that one to Stefan.
Sure. Overtime in, again, when it comes to provincial regulation, including overtime, what the provincial regulations say out is what your legal minimum standard for what you need to pay or give to your workers. In the case of agricultural workers, as an agricultural employer, you're not obliged to pay overtime. So it's the need to move hours around is completely up to you. If you want to go over and above the provincial standard and you want to create some kind of overtime payment scheme for your workers, just to be more similar to maybe other workplaces that you're competing against to get workers, that's totally up to you. So you can obviously issue overtime pay if you want, but based on the question, my understanding is that they're not necessarily looking to go over and above the standard. So the short answer is you don't need to pay overtime for farm workers. So I don't know why you would move the hours around.
Sure. No, I appreciate that. Thank you. And just one last question before we move into the next point. Are there any specific requirements for hiring students that are separate than what you've kind of already outlined? Is there specific areas that you need to look towards if you are looking to hire students?
I would say the general answer is employment standards are consistent regardless of age. And Jen, if you want to weigh in on, I don't know what the minimum human rights ages for having, let's say, non-family workers, you can weigh in on that, but the employment standards apply independent of age.
Yeah, and I know our audience today, I believe, is mostly in Ontario. So I know in like provinces like Manitoba, there's actually, I think, a safety course that students have to take, and there's things like that. But that's not applicable in Ontario at this point. So as long as those standards are being, safety and employment standards are being met, it is in place regardless of age.
Good, thank you. To you
Catherine,
both.
I just wanted to follow up on a question that was asked earlier about WSIB and registering.
Yes, please. Thank you. Yes. Do all farm employers need to register with WSIB? Yes.
Yeah. So if you're hiring someone that is not yourself, your spouse or partner, or someone that you are documenting for your business as an executive officer, then if it's someone that you're hiring, then you have to register with the WSIB within 10 days.
Great. Thanks so much for checking that out, because that actually has come up several times in the question box. So excellent. Thank you. Okay, I'll let you keep going.
Great. So as I mentioned earlier, COVID-19 has brought some changes and some not necessarily new, but different ways of doing things, and has raised a lot of questions around health and safety and PPE and what you need to be doing to keep your employees safe. So we're just going to go through a few of those things just to highlight them and bring them to your attention. The Ontario government has actually done a great job of pulling together some information on a web page that is specific to agriculture. It's a great resource for looking for answers to a lot of the questions that you're going to have around best practices, how to ensure physical distancing, what to do if you can't ensure physical distancing on the job, where to get PPE, all that kind of thing, as well as the Ministry of Labor training and skills development reporting requirements. So I would highly recommend that you take a look at this page because it does link you to a lot of the information that you need today and that you're going to need for the foreseeable future. They also update this page regularly, so if you're looking for the most current information, going to this page is a great way to ensure that you're up to speed with the most current information as well. We talked a little bit about the Employment Standards Act, and there has been a new regulation that's been put in place temporarily around COVID-19. And this regulation is under the Employment Standards Act, and it applies to a non-unionized employee whose employer has temporarily eliminated their hours of work because of COVID-19. So this is around job protection, and it is now covered under the infectious disease emergency leave. So the regulation affects termination, severance, and constructive dismissal rules. Most primary production, we're looking for employees, and we're have a huge amount of work to get done at this time. So you may not see it as much looking to perhaps lay off employees for a period of time or that kind of thing. But it is really necessary to be aware of this and to ensure that you're taking a look at what this new order has so that you ensure you're in line with what is happening with this new act as well, or this new regulation. Whoops, sorry about that. As well, the Government of Ontario guidelines cover things for you as an employer, and it very specifically states that if you find out a worker has been exposed to COVID-19 at work or a related claim has been filed through WSIB, make sure to notify the Ministry of Labor, and if you do have a workplace joint health and safety committee, so that they're aware of the situation. And the Ontario government has also created a new unpaid job protected infectious disease emergency leave that we just saw on the last slide. And this is a way for workers to be able to take leave when they're not able to work due to COVID-19 and still ensure that their job is there when they're ready to return. So again, if you have any questions about that, I would highly recommend that you take a look at the Ontario website.
We've actually just been asked a question, and it comes back to giving the dialogue to employers, small or large, as to how to respond to their team members. What does the employer do if workers claiming the right to refuse to work because of COVID-19? What are some things that can be said, done? Where can you direct employers for kind of guidance on that? So again, what does the employer do if workers claiming the right to refuse to work because of COVID-19?
It's a really good question, and it's something I know that has gotten a little bit of confusion, I think, in the media of how that works. Stefan, have you worked with this directly? This question specifically?
Yeah,
or?
It's a good question, and right now, when it comes to Ontario agriculture, that the definitive answers, it's still a hypothetical concept because Ministry of Labor has not dealt with a refusal to work situation for agriculture workplaces. So it hasn't been played out. So I can't give you a definitive answer. The way that Ministry of Labor is dealing with it in non-agricultural sectors is basically the workers, let's say the rationale that they're presenting, right? When they're saying, I'm not coming in, it needs to be based on actual disease being in the workplace. So they can't just say, oh, I don't trust you to keep me safe. What if you make me sick in the workplace? That will not be upheld by Ministry of Labor, and they will not give your worker the benefit of the doubt. That said, if you have documented disease in your farm, then your worker is fully entitled to say, I'm not coming in until you've shown me that I will not get sick from those disease sources. So I hope that answers the question that the person asked.
Absolutely, because I think that's part of what we're trying to do here is just bring the real dialogue and advice to employers. Nobody asked to be in this situation with the pandemic. So if we can kind of guide people with simple responses and knowing what they can and can't do. And I think your answer was perfect and right on point with that. So thank you.
Great, and it really is a good segue into what we're going to talk about now about keeping employees safe. So there's things that you need to be looking at as far as workplace safety and prevention services. They have a great guideline online specific to agriculture workers. The Ministry of Labor Training and Skills has gotten information out through a webinar that they still have on their website. And there's, again, lots of good information on that main page I showed earlier. But I think it's really important when you're managing your staff, whether you're in a pandemic or not, if you have good communication with your staff, you're engaging them and they feel like they can bring any concerns forward, that's really going to help, because you should be able to then create a workplace where they feel like they can ask questions, they can feel like they can bring a concern forward, they can bring ideas forward as far as maybe better ways of doing things or ideas on how to you know, put barriers in place, for example, if you can't be 2 meters apart, all that kind of thing. And so being able to have those conversations and create that comfortable workplace is going to help you avoid a situation where a worker may feel like they're not safe and refuse to come to work. You want them to be able to bring those concerns to you and be able to help address those concerns before it becomes a work refusal. So I've just lost the presentation.
Yeah, I was just going to say again, if it's like a commercial every time for the importance of rural internet being, I honestly think we should pause here and do a bit of a commercial about the importance of having broadband across rural areas, because this is not the first time we've had a bit of a blip. The Feed Your Future team will be back in just a second. Obviously got connected, but it looks like they're reconnecting here, and we'll be back in just a second. There we go.
Great. Excellent. So we will just, there we go. And you know, when we think about planning for an outbreak, you know, we're over 3 months into this now. We've learned a lot about what to do, and a lot of federal, provincial, local governments have had a chance to put some good guidelines and information in place now, so that it is a little bit easier to have guidance on what to do if you do have an outbreak. But at a minimum, you want to make sure that you have that capacity and protocol for isolating symptomatic or confirmed sick individuals. And if you do have accommodation of your workers, then you want to make sure that that accommodation is in a separate location or separate place. You also want to make sure that you have a written plan or protocol for dealing with an outbreak. For example, you need to be contacting your local health unit. And that local health agency is there to support you, and you should be consulting with them and asking, you know, for guidance and questions and support should you have find yourself in this situation.
I think this is something you've touched on where to go, but this question just came in, so maybe we can go into a bit more detail if you have it, and if not, you can direct them to the right place. Can you explain a bit about the different options for protecting workers from this virus, spreading the virus? For example, barriers, what other procedures can be put into place and do workers have to physical distance at all times? And do they have to wear a mask? Obviously, what if the task requires workers to be closer than 2 meters apart? So a lot in that question, but I think just looking for more detail and guidance, and that's great that that question was asked.
Yeah, sure. And the references here, you'll be able to find really specific detail here, but I can give you some examples. And I would recommend that you look like for the real detail at these sites. But things like, whenever possible, making sure you are keeping those 2 meters apart. I think the Ministry of Labor would say that you know, you want to be able to keep the 2 meters apart whenever possible, and that PPE is like masks and that type of thing is kind of on the chain of response. Hopefully you're keeping the distance, but if you can't, then you do need to have that strong PPE in place. We've certainly seen some innovation happen since the outbreak has occurred with you know, putting plexiglass barriers in place and that kind of thing. I've seen that on planters. I've seen it in different work environments. So there's that type of thing that you can think about, but also you want to make sure that you're increasing the availability of hand washing stations, so that you're keeping that, you're providing access to workers to be able to keep really strong, good hand hygiene. There's things happening which I think is great, where you're keeping your workers in teams. For example, if you have multiple barns or multiple structures, you're keeping your workers in barn teams, so that the level of interaction between all of your workers is very limited. So, you know, if it will help contain a spread if one person gets sick, if they're only interacting with their closest coworkers, it won't spread across all of your workers. Other things, you know, reduce the amount of visitors to your farm as much as possible. When you do have visitors, make sure signage is there so they know where to go. Say if you're getting a delivery to the farm, it's very clear where to go and how to contact someone, so they're not wandering around the farm touching things. You want to make sure that you've really increased your cleaning approaches. So you're, you know, cleaning equipment, cleaning high touch areas like screens, doors, all that kind of thing. Not a time to have everybody in the lunchroom at the same time. You know, the weather's nice. Maybe try to make sure that they can, that there's places to take their breaks and have lunch where they're not all congregating. You know, anything that you can do to ensure that you're reducing the interaction, giving them space, and that kind of thing is helpful. And it's the type of examples that you'll see through, as well as a lot more detail on the sites that I mentioned. Stefan, do you have anything to add to that?
Not to add, but from our experience in the fruit and veg sector, where temporary foreign workers are a big portion of our workforce, I just want to emphasize one point that you made, and that is, to me at least, based on what I've heard, the single biggest thing you can do for the biggest bang for your buck, lowest hanging fruit, whatever you want to call it, to keep your workers safe, is the point Jen made around having the conversations with your workers, that they do everything they can. If they are a crew, because whoever has workers in their industry or personally hires them, you know that they tend to live as a crew, and do everything you can. And it's your time best spent for the 2020 season and probably beyond, is telling them to keep a distance from anyone who's not part of their crew, to resist the urge to make friends in the community. I know it sounds terrible, but the fact is, if you live together, you have a responsibility to the rest of your crew that you're living with, is to keep them safe as well. It's like, be your brother's keeper. Having that conversation of how important it is to not be the person who introduces the disease into the common living spaces, because you can wipe all you want. It's not fair to your colleagues to put them at risk. Yeah, and as an employer, to keep, as Jen said, to keep your team separate from any other employees. I know some people use a mix of domestic workforces and temporary foreign workers, and keeping those teams separate and at all times, and not breaching the 2-meter distance. Even I wouldn't even recommend using stuff like masks or face shields. In that case, I would literally keep anyone who's not part of your cohabitated crew completely separate. Don't even risk it. Why?
So just to follow with that, because I think those were a lot of great points, can you give us some more examples? And this is a question that just came in on how farmers can have positive dialogue with their workers on their farm, whether they be temporary foreign workers, whether they be domestic workers, whether they be any of those really important people that are working on the farm, who may feel particularly vulnerable in terms of pay and job security. What are some things that can be shared, talked about as an employer with your team members around this time to help ease some of those concerns?
That's a really good question. I think some of having the information available, and as Stefan said, sharing that information so that they're really well informed is going to be very helpful. I know there's been a lot of questions as well, like, around, well, what do I do if someone doesn't want to come to work? And I don't want them to feel like if they don't come to work, they're going to lose their job. I want them to feel comfortable to call in sick, kind of thing. That, I mean, at this point in time, making sure you're communicating that clearly to your team is key. You don't want someone feeling like they have to come to work even though they have a bit of a scratchy throat or a bit of a cough, because that one person can infect everybody. And it is much better to be talking to them about the importance of taking care of themselves. And as Stefan said, not keeping their coworkers safe as well, and that responsibility, and just having that conversation and sharing the information constantly is going to help. There's also, if you're sharing the information about the legislation that's in place now about job protection and all that kind of thing, and making sure that they're aware of that, so that that it's beyond your words, that you're aware that there's legislation in place. They don't need to worry. You're a good employer anyway, but the legislation is there, and that their jobs would be protected. The most important thing is that they are taking care of themselves and keeping themselves safe, as well as the rest of their colleagues. Stefan, do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good overview. I would just maybe hit home on 2 things that I would tell my workers in the hypothetical situation that I was an employer. I would probably highlight the fact that if you're sick and you got tested, that's the key part, your income will be protected through WSIB. That's the single biggest thing that I think would benefit a worker. The other thing is, as you said, if you're sick and you take a leave, your job is protected. And I think of all the things that workers worry about, those are the 2 biggest ones. It's unfortunate because I think some of the stuff is misinformation out there, where workers are concerned. If you hear something, why would you not believe it, right? So the facts are, if you're sick and you're tested and positive, your income is protected through WSIB. I believe it's 85% of your historical income. And the claim support now is increasingly being made available in multiple languages. I know that Spanish is now being offered. So if you're a lot of workers are Mexican, so they're going to have support to navigate through that process. There's also parties out there that specialize, NGOs that specialize in helping workers through that process. And the other one is the job protection. I think it's really important that, and I know that industry is starting to develop some kind of concise information pieces. So I think associations are kind of moving collectively towards getting that information out to employers so that they can assure their workers knowing that they have the facts right.
That's great. I really appreciate that transparency, empathy. I think you said it earlier, Stefan, that brotherly, sisterly approach at the end of the day is what we need to focus on. And as that you summarized, both of you, those points excellently.
Thanks. All right, so we'll move along. There's also information around in the Ontario Health and Safety Act, again, about providing that protection to health and safety of the worker. So as far as legislation and regulation goes, you would want to reference that as well. Again, noting that the employer shall take every precaution reasonable in the circumstance to protect the worker. So just very good to be aware of that legislation that is out there. As I mentioned, you know, the Ontario government has done a really good job in getting information out. There is also Workplace Safety and Prevention Services has provided agricultural employers using temporary help. They've provided a really good guide of information about what to do, how to keep people safe, and workers' rights, employers' rights, all that kind of thing is there. Highly recommend taking a look at that as well, so that you are aware of all of this information and it's at your fingertips. As well, when we're talking about temporary foreign workers, there is the guidance for employers for temporary foreign workers that the federal government has put out. Again, easy read, good, very concise information about outlining the criteria for employers. And this document is also updated as need be. So being able to link to this is also good. The Canadian Agriculture Human Resource Council's website has a page that has links to all of these resources. So we've tried to help make it easy for you to find the information that you're looking for as well. So you can always go there if you're not clicking through the webinar after. This document provided by the federal government, it also provides frequently asked questions, which again covers off a lot of the information, questions around requirements for 2 meters, keeping 2 meters apart, bringing people into same accommodations when you bring someone new in or introduce someone new, and how to practice social distancing and making sure that those good hygiene habits are able to be there when new workers are coming in and in their mandatory 14-day isolation period. So that covers off a lot of information, I know. And these are just some reminders of things that you need to think about with knowing your obligations. I know we did go through quite a lot, and one thing that we touched upon a little bit, but we talked about the stresses that are currently there with COVID-19. It just adds an extra level of stress. So one thing that I don't have a slide on, but I always like to talk about, is also ensuring that you're supporting yourself and your staff around mental health. That's important every day, but as we are in this stressful period where people, you know, your workers are concerned about what happens if they get sick, what happens to their income, what happens if someone in their family gets sick, how do they support their family? You know, there's so many things that people are worried about now, in addition to your normal day-to-days, that you need to make sure you're supporting your own mental health and that you're providing that support to your workers as well. It's very, very important. There's, again, links from our website to help connect you with some of those supports as well. And as I mentioned, the CARC does have a toolkit that will help you with all of this and get you to the information that you need, provide you with those templates and resources that have been developed in line with the regulations that are out there. The policy manual, as I mentioned, is a great way to have a document that outlines your policies for your workers and in a way that meets the regulations and acts that are there. But again, there's also things around those, the day-to-day operations of HR, making sure that you have the tools in place that are going to help you operate best HR practices and be a great employer, but also make sure that you're practicing within the regulations and responsibilities that are in place federally and provincially. And so that kind of wraps up the more formal presentation. We've had some questions throughout already, but Catherine, there may be a few more that have popped in.
Yes, there are. One of the questions was around PPE and support programs for sourcing PPE. Are there specific programs where do people access that information, and what does that look like?
Yes, so if you go to the that page, maybe I'll just quickly go back to it because it has a lot of links. The Ontario government has put together, where did the page go? It has put together a website that makes it easier for accessing links to PPE. I believe you can access it through this main page that they've put together, but they do have a page where you can source PPE more easily as well. And
Okay.
Stefan, you probably have more details around that.
Yeah, there is a, in addition to the inventory kind of directory that you referenced, there's also cost share support for farms that want to get some financial support for those purchases. I don't see the link in the presentation, but maybe Catherine, if you want to, do you have a mechanism to follow up for people with links?
Most definitely. We will send out those specific links afterwards. But I think it's a great question because as much as there's the world of information out there, it's a lot of information coming at everyone. So if we can provide that specific one, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, so that's great, Catherine. So I'll just quickly outline it then. We'll send it out. I'll work through Jennifer and Catherine, but it's up to $7,500. I believe the cost share rate is 70%. And it's specifically for kind of precautionary investments you make, whether it's PPE or the plastic barriers that Jen talked about, or other adjustments you make on your farm to keep it safe.
Sure. And I guess just going into a little bit more detail, this question just popped in. What are the current requirements for taking employees' temperatures? Is it an allowed practice? Is it common? What is happening in Ontario in that respect?
Stefan, I'll give that one to you.
Well, you're expected to keep your workers screened. So that's one of your precautionary. There's no prescriptive way how you screen your workers. So you can ask them questions. How are they feeling? But it's highly recommended that you take their temperature. So right now you've got the what's it called? That almost like the forehead zapper. So that's at this point in terms of technology. I've never seen it in action. I've heard of people that have been tested through that whatever that forehead device, and they said it's very non-invasive and they highly recommend it. I don't know how much it costs. So it's easy to say go for it. So if it's affordable to you, I would recommend that. It is a really good way to keep track of your workers' health status. Until workers are completely comfortable with the two facts that we said, that they will be covered, their income will be covered if they are sick, and that they won't lose their job, you will run the risk that they will not tell you that they're sick. And that's our biggest concern right now, is workers being nervous about being forthcoming. So it's in your interest to do the temperature check, because that supplements information.
Going back to information, that kind of leads to this question. There's a lot of information out there. The media chooses to focus on certain areas. If you had a message that, other than what you've just shared, that the broad media would help us in covering, help get the message out there, not just to workers, but individuals of the public, your consumers that are obviously connected with where their food is coming from. What are those messages that we wish for the media to be covering? What are those facts that we want to make sure that they should be focusing on versus some of the things that we have been reading in the news?
Stefan, I think I'll give that one to you as well, because I think you're working closer day to day on things than I am.
Yeah, no, I think you'll be disappointed that you passed it to me, because I don't want this. This is more of an information for employers. That was my understanding. My only commentary is that every time I talk to farmers or anyone in my industry, is they are. It's really tough to see workers be scared. No one wants anyone to get sick, whether it's in their family or their friends, or in that case, their workers. I know a lot of, and I'm assuming this is true for local employees or foreign workers. Actually, ironically, foreign workers tend to have a closer relationship with employers because they tend to stick around for decades. The repeat rate for workers to come back, I think, is way higher than local workers that tend to move on to greener pastures, no pun intended. From farm work, especially, that teenagers move on, they do their summer jobs on the farm, and then they move on to, let's say, move up the ranks to Tim Hortons. The foreign workers tend to come back, and they have much closer relationships. The farmers are, that I speak to, are very concerned about the kind of the mental health of workers, and everyone's really scared, and everyone's doing their best. And I think it's an imperfect world, but everyone's doing their best. And I hope webinars like today help people make the right decision.
And again, not trying to put you on the spot, but I can tell how both of you are so genuine and passionate about what you're trying to do and try to help people. So I think by just sharing that little bit, again, exactly, this is about informing and helping make sure the information is getting into the hands of employers. But obviously, we really appreciate you sharing your perspective there. And hopefully by collaborating like this, we can get our message out. So with that, there aren't any other questions, unless there's some other area that you'd like to cover that you feel we've missed.
I'll just say, Catherine, that, there is a lot of information available, and there's lots of information out there just on what you should be doing. And, we go through all of the acts, for example, and the things that you need to be thinking about in your workplace. And, for us, for me especially, this is kind of what I do day to day. And when you're trying to run your operation or get your crop in the ground and harvest and do all the things that you're doing in a primary production environment, and then think about this on top of it, it can be really challenging. So hopefully this has helped just raise awareness, but also pointed everyone to the tools that are there, because even though there is lots of information, if you go to the right links through what's available through the Ontario.ca website and the HR toolkit, hopefully that will help you get to what you need to know and get to the facts of what you need to know as well, so that you're not frustrated looking for the information or confused as well.
Oh, that's great. Thank you both, Stefan, who works with the Ontario Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, and Jen joining us from the Canadian Ag Human Resource Council. We truly appreciate both of your time today covering this very important topic around rules and regulations and navigating as an employer what the requirements are. So thank you, because not just you joining with your wealth of information, but also thank you to the audience for joining the webinar today. This has been brought to you by the Feed Your Future program, a collaboration with OFA, agcareers.com, careersandfood.com, and many other partners. You will be able to access this webinar online, and we do encourage you to share snippets with members that you feel would benefit from the information. So thank you to you both. I will introduce a little bit of who our Feed Your Future team is. This, as I mentioned at the beginning, is a collaboration of individuals that have put together a toolkit for both employers and job seekers. And you'll see the toolkit and the links on the next slide, just taking a look at the virtual career fair opportunities across Ontario. There are 10 different virtual career fairs that job seekers and employers can participate in, as well as webinars. If you do have any questions, if you take a look at the next slide, you will see some of the upcoming virtual career fairs, and our concierge team that we shared with you can help you as an employer set up a booth, be able to highlight some of the job opportunities that you have, whether it be on your farm, in your agribusiness, in your food processing, manufacturing, or business, any kind of level of the value chain. And these are the dates that are coming up. We've already had several successful virtual career fairs. The upcoming webinars, we do have one on this afternoon that is more focused towards some of the job seekers. If you just look at the next slide, it will show you the dates and times. We'd love to have job seekers join us, as well as other information for you that are on the webinar today. Employers, here are some of the other topics that are coming up. And finally, how to get this information, the last slide. Obviously, this has been made available through the Canadian Agricultural Partnership funding, OFA, agcareers.com, Careers in Food, as well as these other partners that are listed here. We really appreciate the opportunity to collaborate and bring this Feed Your Future campaign and initiative to employers and job seekers in Ontario at the end of the day, putting food on individuals' plates in their homes. So thank you both for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And this webinar will be available online for you to access. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.